The brass band had barely struck its opening note in the municipal gardens when a sharp cry cut through the afternoon pleasantries. At first, the ladies from the Horticultural Society thought one of their cake tables had collapsed, but very quickly it became clear that the centerpiece of the town's annual Compost Pride ceremony had yielded something more troubling than fertilizer. In a pyramid of carefully bagged mulch, arranged to receive the mayor's ribbon snipping, lay the unmistakably limp form of a man. The bunting whipped in the breeze, the cornet squealed and faltered, and the mayor's shears clattered to the paving stones as the crowd surged forward, appalled and thrilled in equal measure. By tea-time, the town was already awash with theories as pungent as the compost itself. Mrs. Cartwright of the drapery muttered, "I always said the gardening society was too cliquey. And now look." The verger at St. Swithin's whispered outside the vicarage, "That man had enemies, mark my words." In the Blue Jug public house, a regular wag declared, "It'll be the council trying to cover something up. Always is." At the parish hall, one of the aldermen offered a bland smile to reporters. "Entirely an unfortunate accident. I hardly think the police need be involved." A greengrocer, sweeping his step, concluded with finality, "It must be jealousy, plain and simple. No one wins that many compost medals without making foes." Inspector Purbright arrived without haste, his deliberate manner already easing the nervous tremors of the crowd. He allowed Sergeant Love to make the customary notes and nod solemnly at witnesses who volunteered contradictory reminiscences. Purbright himself bent low by the compost mound and made a study of the bagging. His gaze rested on one string-tied sack slightly apart, its knot worked backwards compared with the others, as though tied by a left-handed man, or, more curiously, by one deliberately disguising habits. A streak of soil, darker than the rest, led away toward the refreshment tent. To the onlookers it seemed trivial, but to the inspector it was quietly compelling. "You may wish," he murmured without looking up, "to take another photograph from just here." A detail best not overlooked. Whether he meant it for Sergeant Love, the watching townsfolk, or some invisible confidant was not immediately clear. Love, dutifully scratching in his notebook, looked baffled. "It's only dirt, sir?" Purbright straightened, brushing dust from his knees, and allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Only dirt, yes. But dirt can be remarkably instructive. It never lies about where it has been carried." He seemed content to leave the matter there, hands folded behind his back as if on a casual stroll, though his eyes remained fixed upon the retreating line of soil grains disappearing among the sandwiches and sponge cakes. The mayor, recovering his composure, tried to steer attention toward the resumption of the ceremony, but Purbright interrupted with quiet courtesy. "Forgive me, Mr. Mayor, but I should hesitate to let the festivities continue until we are certain this prize heap contains nothing further worth disturbing." His words were so mild, they reached the audience like a draught of cool air, but their meaning snapped minds alert. In an instant, the tidy assumptions of accident or natural death withered. Then a constable's exclamation rent the uneasy silence. In searching beneath the bag where Purbright had stooped, he had found not another body, but something nearly as shocking, a silver-plated trophy goblet meant for that day's horticultural champion, lying askew and crusted with a trace of blood along its rim. The crowd gasped, conversations tumbled into one another like dominoes. If the victim had been struck down and the very prize of the contest transformed into a weapon, what did that say about the genial competitions of their genteel town? Speculation would ignite like dry tinder now, racing from parlor to public house until everyone had a theory, and nobody yet admitted to fear. Purbright offered only his measured glance and a single gentle remark. "Curious, isn't it, how honors can weigh heavier than earth itself?" With that, he turned aside, leaving behind a growing murmur of dread, curiosity, and anticipation that would carry the viewer firmly toward the next chapter. More answers would surely come. but whose theory among the townsfolk and among the viewers themselves would prove closest to the truth. The body had been carried discreetly away by the police van under a tarpaulin, though not before half the town had contrived to glimpse it and speculate upon the identity. The mayor insisted loudly to anyone within earshot that the unfortunate incident must not halt the judging of vegetables, roses, and, above all, the compost contest, whose winner still awaited announcement. His insistence was more desperate than persuasive. Mothers shepherded their children home, clutching them closer than usual, while fathers lingered in hopes of more details filtering through the police cordon. The municipal gardens, once preoccupied with jam stalls and chrysanthemums, were now gripped by fear, indignation, and a thrilling whiff of scandal that lent the event an unwelcome notoriety. Sergeant Love, faithful shadow of the inspector, leaned toward Purbright as they walked the length of flower displays, now dimmed by their proximity to tragedy. "So," he began earnestly, "we've a murdered man found buried in compost, and the mayor's best cup put to violent use. Do we even know yet who the poor fellow is?" Purbright's expression held its characteristic mildness, as though the matter were not one of blooded goblets, but of missing library books. "We do not, Sergeant. His pockets were reassuringly empty. No wallet, no papers, no tokens of identity, though I dare say several here have already convinced themselves they recognized him." Indeed, at that very moment, Mrs. Cartwright was still loudly telling those within hearing that she was certain it was the fellow from the building society, while the verger muttered confidentially that he looked remarkably like a second cousin twice removed of the local butcher. Both theories happily disregarded that both gentlemen were on hand and taking a lively part in the gossip themselves. Still, there were certain unavoidable facts. The trophy that should have crowned the compost champion was missing until found bloodied in the heap itself. The knot on the suspicious sack had been peculiar, a little flourish of false clumsiness that hinted, at least to Purbright, at deliberation. And then there was the soil trail leading no farther than the tables where sandwiches and ginger beer had been dispensed. This last Purbright had not ignored, though he contentedly allowed Love to struggle with its significance for a while. "Suppose," the sergeant pondered aloud, "our fellow was felled with the trophy somewhere close. If the killer wanted only to hide the body, depositing it among compost bags would be awkward business in public view. People about everywhere, eyes on all sides." He frowned downward at his boots. "Unless it was done ahead of the ceremony, in the night. That'd be possible." Purbright, who had paused to regard the remains of a victorious sponge suffering neglect on the refreshment table, inclined his head in agreement. A possibility indeed, though one must be careful not to let the assumption of convenience smother fact. If the body was placed here beforehand, how curious that none of the gardeners noticed when arranging their exhibits. They are a conscientious lot, the gardening society. Not men, nor women, prone to overlooking bundles out of place. This observation left Love grimacing in thought, his mind turning over the difficulty of smuggling a body into civic gardens undetected. Their circuit carried them now into the marquee, where a row of trestle tables bore entries of marrow, beetroot, and cabbage ranked with the solemnity of bishops. Conversation dipped respectfully as the inspector entered, as though the vegetables themselves demanded quiet deference to official inquiry. Purbright's eyes roamed not the produce, however, but the people, the flushed gardeners, the simmering competitiveness that hung thick as paraffin fumes. Quite a few avoided his glance, though with what motive it was impossible to yet determine. It was the mayor, wading paternally through exhibitors who sought to restore good cheer. "Inspector, dreadful business, of course, but we must not throw suspicion about lightly. These men and women live for their gardens. They wouldn't hurt a fly." "A fortunate trait, if universally true," Purbright replied amiably. "However, I find that even harmless creatures can sting when disturbed sufficiently." His eyes alighted gently upon a middle-aged man fussing at a monstrous marrow. The fellow flushed deeply at being noticed, so much so that perspiration ran down his temples. "That's Mr. Blythe," whispered Love, perceiving the direction of the inspector's look. "Chairman of the gardening committee. Strong views about soil preparation, apparently. Did you see how he flinched when the constable lifted that goblet?" Purbright's smile remained fixed but unrevealing. He allowed the moment to pass, making only a mental note. Instead, he turned conversationally to the crowd at large. "Might any of you have observed a stranger in the grounds earlier today? Someone not much given to fertilizer or flower beds?" Several exchanged uncertain glances, though none volunteered an answer more meaningful than that a traveling brush salesman had been bothering them a few days ago. It was as they left the marquee that fortune, or perhaps calculation, produced one small revelation. A constable, tugging sheepishly at his cap, hurried up with something clasped in his hand. "Beg pardon, sir. Found this under a side table by the drinks." He extended a folded scrap, damp from spilt lemonade. It was a torn portion of a leaf from the horticultural program, the official booklet printed with neat lists of entrants. Across it, someone had scribbled hastily in blunt pencil a single word: "Tonight." Purbright turned the scrap between his fingers as though weighing its significance. Love, however, could not restrain himself. "A note, sir? Left for the victim, do you think? To meet tonight? Perhaps. Or perhaps a reminder to fetch his supper," Purbright murmured almost humorously. "I wonder, though. The fragment is dirty, but not greatly worn. I fancy it was discarded not many minutes before discovery." He delivered these reflections mildly, but with that quiet assurance that left Sergeant Love to puzzle at hidden meaning. By evening, the town centre carried the carnival air of scandal. Shop doors had little knots of gossip outside, passing on distorted renderings of the day's drama. Some maintained that 2 bodies had been found, others that the victim was a notorious criminal escaping justice. Only the inspector and his sergeant, tramping patiently between constabulary and gardens, kept to the hard path of evidence. Within the police station's small interview room, Purbright allowed Love the satisfaction of questioning the first witnesses: the mayor, Mr. Blythe, and 3 of the committee women. Their remarks were long, indignant, and faintly self-congratulatory in showing civic spirit. Each of them had some opinion about which other committee member was undoubtedly up to mischief, though all prefaces ended with a disclaimer of absolute knowledge. Purbright, seated quietly in shadow, made only the occasional request for a repetition of some phrase or gesture. To the unobservant, it seemed he might easily have fallen asleep, but anyone watching his eyes closely would have seen a faint glimmer of calculation at the turns of speech. The witness statements confirmed at least one matter. None admitted to seeing when or how the trophy cup vanished. The mayor was firm that it had been brought from the council office only that morning, placed under guard by a clerk until its unveiling. Yet no clerk could be found now, and the councillor responsible professed ignorance of his sudden absence. The fact sat in the record like a pebble in soup. Undeniable, indigestible, but offering little flavour by itself. At length, the questioning drew to an end. Love shut his notebook dramatically, clearly pleased with himself for filling 6 whole pages. "Well, sir, there's a pattern, don't you think? The mayor is keen to brush it all away, Blythe sweating like a watering can, and that missing cup steward. Might these 3 not be our starting suspects?" Purbright, rising slowly from his chair, looked as if he were considering whether to extinguish his pipe before replying. "A fair suggestion. Though the trouble with beginnings, Sergeant, is that one seldom recognizes them until halfway through the tale." He smiled faintly as he tucked the scrap of program leaf into his breast pocket. "Still, for the moment, let us allow our friends in the town a little rest. We may discover tomorrow that some of them slept more heavily than others, if at all." The words seemed harmless, but the inspector's eyes twinkled in that peculiar way, almost as though he were addressing someone beyond the bare walls of the interview room. It left Sergeant Love faintly unsettled, yet certain too that his superior had already grasped some thread lost on everyone else. And when Purbright turned toward the window, regarding the lamplight playing against the cobbles outside, his final remark for the evening sealed the suspense. "So much may be learned, Sergeant, from the things people try to hide in plain sight. We must watch how this garden grows." The discovery of the red thread had given the investigation its first tangible direction, though to any other eye it might have looked merely like the frayed end of a duster. Purbright, however, handled it as if it were a delicate flower requiring cautious transplanting. He tucked it into an envelope with such ceremony that one might have thought an entire confession had been tucked inside. Sergeant Love, still struggling with the abstract quality of his superior's deductions, contented himself by recording "piece of red thread, possible from dress or costume," with his usual hopeful punctuation of question marks. By the following morning, Flaxborough hummed like a hive poked with a stick. Every shop doorway leaned under the weight of gossip, and every half-glimpsed detail had already transformed into speculation. Some swore that Edwin Garlick had been killed by a jealous rival gardener, citing his unblemished record in the Compost stakes. Others hinted darkly at council corruption, the missing clerk providing fertile ground for suspicion, and a few, wilder still, confided that the murder had something to do with communists, smuggling organizations, or the bishop's new initiative to shorten sermons. Each theory was delivered with forthright certainty and an assurance that Inspector Purbright would surely confirm it any moment. Purbright himself left his office that morning with Sergeant Love, trailing, notebook at the ready. Their first call was naturally upon the missing council clerk, one Henry Harrow, whose desk in the administrative offices looked abandoned in unhelpfully dramatic fashion. A half-drunk cup of tea stood beside a neat stack of papers, his chair pushed back as though he had only stepped away a moment. The mayor, summoned to give an account, fluttered helplessly about the room. "Left yesterday afternoon just after luncheon," he explained with a damp handkerchief in hand. "Said he needed air. Quite unlike him not to return by tea." Love scribbled furiously. "So he takes the cup from the office to the mayor's table, then disappears altogether. That does look rather bad, sir." "Possibly," Purbright said in a tone that suggested it might also look rather convenient. He strolled about the clerk's tiny filing cabinets, eyes grazing over files marked "Compost Ceremony, Past Winners." From one protruded a slip of paper as red as the earlier thread. He drew it out carefully. It was an order chit for ribbons supplied to the gardening committee. Scarlet satin, 20 yards, tied and delivered 3 days previously. "Ah," murmured Purbright, almost to himself. "Thread becomes ribbon, ribbon becomes display." Though one wonders what, besides the usual bunting, required so liberal an amount. The mayor shifted uncomfortably, already sensing that a simple explanation of festive decoration would not quite weather Purbright's gaze. "Some of it for the prize dais, I suppose. Mr. Blythe was insistent on more colour this year." Love leaned closer. "Could match our find from the compost heap, sir." "Perhaps, Sergeant," Purbright allowed. "Perhaps not." He replaced the chit neatly, as if returning a flower to its stem, and turned the conversation elsewhere. They next called upon Mr. Blythe himself, chairman of the gardening committee, who received them in a greenhouse both steamy and odorous, filled with cucumbers swelling on their vines. The man's cheerfulness seemed somewhat forced, and beads of sweat ran down his temples in rhythm to his denials. "It beggars belief," Blythe insisted, polishing his spectacles upon his sleeve, "to think anyone would soil the reputation of our society with such brutality. Edwin was difficult, perhaps, yes, but not deserving this. I hardly slept. My wife will tell you as much. As for that trophy, I hadn't seen it all morning." Purbright blinked mildly through the humid air. "You had quarrels with our unfortunate, no doubt." "All committees thrive upon them," Blythe chuckled nervously. "Who hasn't, Inspector?" The man would crow about his methods, never shared, never published, always claimed he had a secret mixture. Everyone resented it. But murder? Good heavens, not by my hand. Love jotted keenly, seizing upon the word resented. Purbright, however, wandered among the cucumbers, observing a careless loop of scarlet ribbon tied around one trellis, its end cut short and frayed. He fingered it briefly, then merely smiled at Blythe. "A fine harvest you keep here. One might suspect it is watered not only by pipes, but by ambition. We shall hope the crop continues untarnished." As they walked back toward the station, Love spoke in hushed tones, determined not to miss the opportunity of a conclusion. "That ribbon, sir, same as our thread, no mistake. Found in Blythe's greenhouse. He must be the man, mustn't he?" Purbright's expression remained patient, even gentle. "Ah, Sergeant, conclusions are like compost heaps. They must be turned over more than once before you may grow anything reliable upon them." He tapped his coat pocket where both thread and chit now resided. "Still, it is useful to see red at every turn." By afternoon, word of Mr. Garlick's death had reached his widow in more official tones. She sent word requesting a further call from the inspector. They found her this time in genuine black, her visage sharpened with something more than grief, perhaps resentment or even determination. "I will not deny," she declared, hands folded tightly together, "that my husband had enemies enough among committee members and neighbors. But if you truly want to know who hated him most, it was Henry Harrow. That clerk detested Edwin for boasting about his wins. He said once that he would see him buried in his own manure, if only fate allowed." Love made an exclamation of discovery and began scribbling, but Purbright's quiet eyes rested on Mrs. Garlick's trembling fingers. He asked softly, "You are certain, madam, that these were the clerk's very words?" "As certain as I am that ribbon frays when cut too quickly," she said, without realizing the image she had conjured. Outside in the fading light, Love exhaled triumphantly. "So we have it then, sir. A motive, a threat, and the man gone missing to boot." Purbright did not answer immediately. He studied the row of geraniums standing stiff against Mrs. Garlick's window-sill, the bright red of their blooms sharp against the evening dimness. At last, he murmured, "Curious, Sergeant. Geraniums, cucumbers, compost. Red threads everywhere we look, yet clarity nowhere." That night, the inspector convened his constables again, pinning the growing fragments to their evidence board. Photographs of footprints, the goblet weapon under glass, notes of Harrow's disappearance, Mrs. Garlick's testimony, and Blythe's odd ribbon. The men shifted uncomfortably as these facts lay side by side, refusing to arrange themselves into a proper pattern. Love gripped his pencil as though force might compel them into a confession on the board. "There's an answer here, sir," he insisted, pointing at the overlapping notes. "The clerk and the chairman, they stand out. One missing, one lying. Surely, sir, one if not both of them must be behind this." Purbright lit his pipe and sat, mild as if preparing to read a child to bed. "Possibly, Sergeant. Yet recall what Cordelia said. So young, my lord, and true. Such certainties are not always rewarded. Our task is to distinguish who gains. For envy is common, but murder is paid for in profit rather than pique. Let us ask ourselves tomorrow not who hated Mr. Garlick, but who now thrives because he is gone." The sergeant nodded reluctantly, while the inspector's eyes strayed again toward the fragment of red, pinned like a flower against the notice board. For the faintest turn of an instant, his gaze seemed to meet that of an unseen witness beyond the constabulary walls, as if to invite them to consider, too, who, among these prim citizens, had cultivated not compost, but consequence. The following morning dawned unseasonably bright, as if the weather itself resisted draping a respectful shroud over Flaxborough's scandal. Yet the brightness only sharpened the edges of disquiet. Shopfront chatter had settled into a kind of disciplined rhythm. Every customer, before purchasing so much as a turnip, demanded the shopkeeper's current theory of garlic's death. Even the butcher, normally content with sweat and sausages, began each sale with an unsolicited remark on suspicious character traits in town. The matter had moved swiftly from shock to ritualized speculation, and everybody already had their performance memorized. Inspector Purbright, whose indifference to climate extended also to communal hysteria, was seated in his office when a small telegram was placed before him. The note, perfunctory and curt, announced that Henry Harrow, the missing council clerk, had been sighted boarding a train south from the neighboring county station late the previous evening. He did not purchase a ticket under his own name, but a guard recalled the nervous fellow with certainty. The telegram might have been the ending of a mystery to Love. To Purbright, it was only the beginning of a more perplexing chapter. "Well, sir," said Love as he finished reading the same words aloud. "That places the clerk squarely in guilt. He threatened garlic, disappeared during the crime, and now runs away. If that isn't a confession in shoe leather, I don't know what is." Purbright smiled faintly at his sergeant as if acknowledging a schoolboy's earnest answer. "It paints him a villain indeed, Sergeant, which is precisely why one ought to be slow in daubing him so." He folded the telegram neatly and placed it under his pipe on the desk. "If guilt were always what first seems, our efforts would be mere clerical convenience." Before Love could protest, Constable Dacre appeared in the doorway, cap in hand, offering fresh news. A second item of evidence had emerged. One of the stallholders from the Compost ceremony reported discovering a pair of gardening gloves, stuffed beneath the table where cider had been served. They were caked not only with soil, but with the unmistakable crust of dried blood. Love's eyes shone. "Another nail for the clerk's coffin, sir." But Purbright only rose quietly and requested they walk to the stallholder's yard. The gloves lay upon a wooden crate, pitifully ordinary objects, their leather cracked from habitual use. Purbright handled them gently, noting the heavy crust along the right fingertips. What drew his true attention, however, was the faint scent that clung even beneath the sourness of blood. A mingling of mineral fertilizer and something sharper, chemical in nature. He held the gloves to his nose a moment, thoughtful. Our departed Mr. Garlic, as I gather, prided himself in organic practice. Nothing artificial would have crossed his heap. These gloves, however, reek of more ambitious concoctions. He turned to the stallholder. "Do they belong to anyone here?" The man swore they did not. He had cleared his tables at dusk, finding the intruders only that morning. The implication was obvious. The murderer had discarded them during the uproar. Returning toward the station, Love brimmed with satisfaction. "So now we've the clerk on a train. Gloves abandoned at the scene. A long-standing grudge. It's as perfect as marrow on a show table." Purbright ambled, hands loosely folded behind him, and offered only, "Such perfection, Sergeant, too often resembles theatre. We must be wary that we are not merely observing a performance. If Henry Harrow is the author of this pageant, I shall be most surprised. Far more likely, he is but employed as its scenery." The sergeant frowned, uncertain how to record this in his notebook. It was not long before further distraction arrived. The council assembly, flushed and restless, demanded Purbright's presence for what they named a full account. In truth, it was an exercise in covering their collective dignity, but Purbright accepted the summons with usual equanimity. The meeting took place in the municipal chambers, where polished oak benches echoed with restless coughs and shuffling feet. Every councillor wished to display grief, while simultaneously reassuring the town's merchants that business would be untouched. The mayor presided with a grave cough, introducing Purbright with solemn pomp. "What reassurance can we return to our citizens, Inspector?" Purbright, who gave nothing so vulgar as reassurance when there was none to give, spoke with his quiet edge of humour. That their counsel remains attentive will no doubt be reassuring by itself. As for criminal matters, those we prefer to prove before we announce." His words fell with a cooling effect over their nerves, and some counsellors glared at one another for not having anticipated this response. It was during this gathering that a peculiar event unsettled even Purbright's composure. A message was handed to him midway through the session, a folded paper delivered by a clerk's boy. Upon opening, it revealed no more than one line written in a hurried, almost childish scrawl. He got what was coming. No signature, no address. Love, peering over his shoulder, hissed softly, "A confession, sir." "Or theatre again," Purbright murmured, folding the note into his pocket. The ripple of unease around the chamber showed that rumors of the anonymous message needed no constable to spread them. Already the audience muttered among themselves that proof of conspiracy existed. The inspector allowed the murmur to swell. Noise, after all, has a way of shaking loose truths if listened to with patience. By late afternoon, Purbright and Love visited the Garlick home once more. Mrs. Garlick received them stiffly, though her black garb had already begun to look less like mourning than uniform. The inspector, politely declining tea, asked a few questions about the chemicals Edwin may have used. He would never touch the artificials, she answered firmly. Swore they weakened the true purpose of soil, but his rivals, they were not so particular. Blythe especially. He buys powders in bulk from the agricultural shop. You ask them yourself. Her bitterness showed no outward grief, and Love whispered to Purbright as they departed, "Almost relieved, isn't she, sir? If it were my husband dead, I'd be weeping still." "Some prefer economy in tears, Sergeant. They last longer when rationed, but I agree that the lady reveals more than she intends." The inspector did not elaborate, but his eyes returned as ever to the red thread now secured in his evidence folder. That evening, Flaxborough received its most dramatic excitement yet. As townsfolk clustered outside the post office, news spread that Henry Harrow himself had been located, not far away in London or hidden abroad, but stumbling faintly drunk out of a riverside tavern in the very next town. Constables returned him to the local cell that night, clamping him up to await interrogation. The crowd, delighted, celebrated as if crime itself had been concluded. Men slapped backs approvingly, women exchanged knowing glances. Just as we thought, the clerk all along. But within the station, Purbright did not share this easy satisfaction. He stood by the cell door, listening to Harrow's snores, deep, miserable, and punctuated by groans of cheap gin. The inspector's brow furrowed only slightly as he remarked to Love, "Our stage has produced its villain, perhaps too conveniently. Let us see what part he truly plays once interrogated." Love could hardly contain his excitement. "You think—" "He'll crack, sir. Confess everything." Purbright smiled with his mild, baffling humor. "Sergeant, men who are actors rarely remember their lines. Tomorrow we shall see who has written his." And with that, the inspector extinguished his pipe, leaving the doubts to grow in the quiet as steadily as weeds beneath the well-tended flower beds of Flaxborough. The night passed slowly in the station, the murmurs from Flaxborough's streets humming late into the small hours like echoes of a fairground. The townsfolk had determined themselves satisfied. A villain had been found, placed in the cell, and, by the magic arithmetic of gossip, justice was already considered done. If truth could be conjured from whispers alone, the constabulary might become redundant. But morning found Purbright calm as ever, coaxing his pipe to life while Sergeant Love clattered at his notebook, eager to make sense of what was plainly obvious to him and curiously elusive to his inspector. Harrow sat in the interrogation room, pale and trembling from the night before. The stink of stale gin and cheap tobacco hung about him like a guilty cloak, and his eyes darted with suspicion at every shadow. Love leaned across the table, pencil poised, voice firm. "You've much to account for, Mr. Harrow. Threats against Mr. Garlick, your sudden disappearance, gloves stained with blood found near the scene, and then your attempt to slip away on a train. A jury wouldn't take long with that list. Harrow shook his head violently. No, I never laid a hand on him. I talk when I'm drunk, yes. Foolish words. Everyone talks when they're bitter. I hated him, hated his pompous face. But murder? I'd not stomach it. Purbright, who had thus far observed silently, now spoke so gently that Harrow winced as if pricked by something sharper than accusation. Tell us how you spent yesterday, Mr. Harrow. Leave nothing out, however trivial. The clerk wrung his hands, beginning an account that meandered through office duties, an early luncheon, and then, more haltingly, his intention to resign. I'd had enough of them, endless errands for the committee, polishing what wasn't mine. Garlick laughed at me, said even the trophies looked cleaner than my suit. I left, yes, walked to the station. I thought I'd go anywhere else. I boarded a train with no ticket and no luggage, but then I panicked, got off again at the next town, and went to the tavern. I swear it, I never went back. Love scoffed behind his pencil. How convenient. All the while, your enemy turns up dead with the very goblet you handled last. No, Harrow cried, desperation edging his voice. He polished it himself before the show. Ask his wife, she'll say it. I never touched it yesterday. Purbright leaned back, studying the trembling figure as though he were a specimen in a jar. The inspector's mild eyes moved at last to the gloves laid in evidence, the red-stained fingers pointing mutely across the table. You deny ownership of these? Harrow's face twisted with disgust. Never saw them before. Too big for me, besides. His hands spread upon the table, small, fine-boned, hardly the sort to fill the heavy leather gauntlets. Love glanced at Purbright, crestfallen. But, sir, the inspector held up one hand. It would appear, Sergeant, that facts may resist our desire for neatness. These gloves are indeed quite large. He stood then, tapped the ashes from his pipe. That will suffice for the moment, Mr. Harrow. Constable will see you back to your cell, where you may find a clearer conscience, or at least a clearer head. Afterwards, in the quiet of his office, Love frowned over his notes like a man confounded at why numbers would not add. But everything fits the clerk, sir. Motive, anger, disappearance. Only a guilty man runs. Purbright's voice floated back softly, like water over stones. A guilty man runs, yes. But an innocent man also, if convinced the chase is hopeless. We must be modest about certainty, Sergeant. He paused, and then drew from his coat again the fragment of ribbon. Think instead how the truth hides itself in plain view, tied up perhaps in a display, looped in some decorative flourish. We must look again at the living, not only the trembling drunk in our cell. That afternoon they visited the agricultural shop, as Mrs. Garlick had urged. The proprietor, an elderly man with spectacles perched like small moons upon his nose, admitted readily that Mr. Blythe had purchased chemicals only last week, powders for enhancing soil. Not exactly legal, Inspector, he added with the relish of a man unaccustomed to drama, though garden societies look the other way if it promises monstrous marrows. Purbright nodded serenely. Was anyone accompanying him? The shopkeeper thought hard, then smiled thinly. Yes, now you mention it. One of the society ladies, Miss Trimble, keeps herself brisk. Ordered more ribbon that day, too. Red to match the dais. Love's eyes darted to Purbright, but the inspector offered no triumph. Instead, he raised another question. And did the lady or the chairman mention our Mr. Garlick? The man's brow creased. Well now, the lady said Garlick would be bound to lose this year, one way or another. The words hung like acrid smoke. The sergeant's pencil scratched wildly into his book, but Purbright thanked the shopkeeper with such calm politeness that one might forget murder was under discussion at all. As the daylight began to slip, the inspector and his sergeant walked through the narrow lanes toward Miss Trimble's neat villa. It sat glossy and precise, hedges clipped with military discipline. The lady herself opened the door, her expression composed, but her eyes betraying a sharpness too keenly tuned for comfort. She ushered them into a drawing-room fragrant with lavender water, where red ribbons indeed adorned vases with theatrical extravagance. "My condolences, Inspector," she said, though with little softness. Poor Garlic, but it was bound to come. Men who make too many enemies rarely last a lifetime. Love leaned forward like a hound flushed to quarry. "You saw him yesterday?" "I did not. I avoid such coarse exhibitions." She waved a hand, disdain dripping. "The whole contest is a foolish display of egos. I prefer refinement in gardening, not this earthy circus." Purbright's gaze rested gently on the ribbons trailing the mantelpiece. "A shame, then, that you insisted on so much scarlet satin for the ceremony. One might almost say you dressed the town in it." Her lips tightened fractionally. "Decoration. Councillor Blythe requested it. I obtained it as a favor." "But you did remark to the shopkeeper," Purbright said mildly, "that Garlic would be bound to lose one way or another." She smiled then, just faintly as if correcting him. "I said he could not win forever. It is hardly prophecy." Love bristled, but Purbright only smiled at her as one might to an eager pupil inventing her own lesson. He rose after a courteous interval. "We thank you, Miss Trimble. Your ribbons make a striking note in this household. I dare say they brighten even darker matters." Outside, the sergeant burst with frustration. She as good as admitted it. Her words, the ribbons, her dislike of Garlic. "Surely she's the one, sir." Purbright walked on, letting their shoes tap rhythmically upon the pavement. "Possibly, Sergeant. But dislike is as common as a dandelion. Murder grows not in the soil of distaste alone. It requires nourishment of advantage. Ask yourself, who gains by Garlic's death? Who prospers from his absence, not merely in trophies, but in influence?" Love faltered, at a loss. Purbright's eyes glinted with that mild humor, a flicker seeming to address not just his sergeant, but all who cared to listen from beyond. "That, Sergeant, is the route we must uncover. Until then, you may note carefully that red runs everywhere through this garden of ours, and yet blood itself permits no imitators. When the two truly meet, we shall know." And so the evening settled again over Flaxborough, leaving more suspects entangled among their own ribbons, and Inspector Purbright quietly measuring which of them had stitched the pattern deliberately. The next morning began with rain, a thin drizzle that flattened Flaxborough's optimism and streaked the panes of the police station with melancholy. Unlike gossip, rain dampened enthusiasm, and yet the townsfolk managed to adapt. Umbrellas leaned close together, allowed secretive exchanges, while queues at shop counters became perfect shelters for whispered theories. Purbright, however, welcomed the dreary weather in his usual equanimous way. It blurred edges and hushed noises, providing spaces where people revealed themselves through quiet rather than clamor. Honteur. Breakfast, Sergeant Love devoured his bacon with the air of a man convinced he was nearer than ever to case closure. "We've them clear enough now," he said without hesitation. "Harrow the drunkard who threatened Garlic, Blythe with his chemicals, Miss Trimble with her ribbons. Any one of them could have bludgeoned him. Surely all roads lead to the garden committee, sir. A committee's nothing but quarrels in hats." Purbright stirred his tea as though meditating upon the laws of tides. "Roads may lead toward quarrel, Sergeant, but not always toward consequence. We must see which of these quarrels spilt into profit, and who harvested the advantage of Garlic's removal. Until then, all is but rhetoric." Love sighed, but filled more pages of his notebook nonetheless, knowing from experience that Purbright's gentle evasions concealed conclusions rather than the absence of them. By mid-morning, excitement arrived in the form of Constable Dacre hurrying into the inspector's office with flushed cheeks. "Sir, the Women's Guild is in uproar. There's been another disturbance at St. Swithin's." Purbright raised a mild eyebrow, tamping his pipe. "The church seems restless lately. What form of mischief, Constable?" Hymn board, sir, Dacre answered breathlessly. Someone's rearranged the numbers. Instead of the listed hymns, it now shows the figures 116 and 211. Love barked a confused laugh. Hardly a crime unless Flaxborough now outlaws arithmetic. Children likely did it. But Purbright had straightened ever so slightly, his gaze sharpening in the way that foretold a deeper turn. Numbers, Sergeant, are never arbitrary when chosen in secret. Hymn boards may whisper what mouths cannot. They walked the short distance to the church, where the vicar fluttered nervously about the altered board. I swear to heaven, gentlemen, I did not place those numbers. I left the building locked last evening. Purbright studied the two figures, 116 and 211, and then glanced toward the pew where several members of the gardening committee now sat, as though compelled by curiosity. He murmured with a trace of amusement, "Statistical symbols, perhaps, or references more local." Then, leaning toward Love, "What is the program number for Mr. Garlick's compost entry last year?" Love flipped through notes and answered with surprise, 116, sir." "Ah," Purbright smiled faintly. "And the slot reserved for this year's intended champion, who would have taken Garlick's crown, what was his number?" Again, Love's pencil scrolled through the margins until he found it. 211, Chairman Blythe himself. Purbright hummed like a man enjoying a faintly discordant chord in music. "A sermon has been offered to us in figures if only we attend." The sight had already stirred speculation in the congregation gathered outside. Some muttered that Blythe was declaring triumph, others that it was some coded threat. Either way, suspicion fattened upon him like weeds after rain. Blythe, when confronted, spluttered indignantly, swore his innocence, accused the vicar of incompetence, and fled the porch red with agitation. Love scribbled and whistled. "It's open boast, isn't it? He's telling the world that Garlick's number is struck off and his own is next." "Or," Purbright said softly, "someone wishes us all to think so. Numbers can be assigned as easily as ribbons affixed to vases. What matters is the hand that altered the board, not the digits themselves." His gaze drifted across the street where Mrs. Garlick herself was conveniently walking, umbrella neat against the drizzle, gaze straight and proud. She made no effort to join the curious crowd, which earned her silent notice from Purbright. Later that afternoon, the inspector arranged for the committee to be gathered once more at the municipal hall. They arrived in varying states of irritation and fear, some eager to exonerate themselves by accusing others. Mr. Blythe, in particular, made so vigorous a show of his innocence that his protestations became almost theatrical. Miss Trimble sat stiff, lips drawn, her eyes cool upon the inspector as if braced for a fight. Mrs. Goodbody maintained pious outrage, declaring the whole incident proof that competitions distorted otherwise peaceful souls. Purbright, presiding with his mild air, addressed them not as suspects, but as quarrelsome children. "I regret the shadow cast upon your society, yet shadows are curious things. They reveal shape more vividly than sunlight. One wonders at such numbers appearing in your parish hall. Some would think it a victory crowed, others intimidation delivered. But what interests me is not meaning, but opportunity. Who had keys to the church, for instance?" The vicar cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Only myself, the sexton, and on special days, the ladies of the Guild for Flower Arranging." "Flower arranging, indeed," Purbright echoed gently. His glance turned just long enough toward Miss Trimble before he let it drift away again as if idle. The meeting dissolved into quarrels and whispered recrimination, but Purbright left with a contented air. Outside, Love muttered, "You suspected her, sir? I saw the way you looked. She's a flower guild, access to the church, ribbon folding, bitter against Garlick. Shall we bring her in?" "Bring her in, yes," Purbright said, "but not yet. Let the garden alone a little longer, Sergeant, and see what weeds grow proud enough to reach above the hedge." By evening, the rain cleared. leaving the town glistening under weak sunlight. Just as the inspector prepared to leave for supper, another message reached the station. This one was not written in mocking anonymous scrawl, but scrawled hastily on a torn scrap of hymn book paper, delivered by a trembling choir boy who claimed he had found it on the vestry floor. "Ask the widow. She lies." Love's exclamation was instant and unrestrained. "It must be her, then. We've suspected rivals, chairmen, spinsters, but the one that truly benefits is Mrs. Garlick. Her husband out of the way, perhaps money, perhaps simply peace. She could slip into the church by virtue of her friendship with the guild, and she's kept herself curiously composed, I'd say." Purbright held the note delicately between his fingers. The ink was still damp at the edges, as though placed only that very day. He leaned back, expression unreadable, then said with perfect calm, "Yes, Sergeant. She lies. The question is not whether human beings lie as naturally as bees swarm, but what precise fact she conceals. Until that is uncovered, deduction is mere theatre. Patience, love. The stage is not yet set to show its lead actor." His words, though quiet, carried the deliberate weight of progress, and even as Love tucked his notes with irritation and anticipation mingled, one could feel the story closing upon its central knot. The town, the committee, the widow, all entangled in ribbons red, in numbers displayed, in secrecy like weeds coiling tight. Only Purbright, calm as winter soil, seemed certain that the harvest was near, and the next disturbance would lay bare roots no committee could conceal. The vestry note lingered in Purbright's pocket like a seed refusing to germinate. Its words, "Ask the widow. She lies," circulated through his mind without agitation, only a quiet acknowledgement, the way he might regard a weed springing up between carefully tended roses. Love, of course, found himself unable to keep still, pacing the inspector's office as the hour grew late. "If it points to Mrs. Garlick, sir, shouldn't we act? We've let her speak twice now, both times skirting around details. If she wasn't at the ceremony, how did she know that he'd polished the goblet? That was her claim, wasn't it? She places the weapon in her husband's hands, then feigns distance. It must be deliberate misdirection." Purbright tamped the bowl of his pipe with slow patience before replying. "Your vigor is admirable, Sergeant, but remember, lying is the most common currency in human speech. She lies, yes. So too do others. The intrigue lies not in the lie itself, but in the ledger of what profit it brings the liar." Love frowned, muttering something about ledgers being easier to follow with actual numbers. Still, he could not deny that the inspector's tone suggested matters whispered close to revelation. The following day's duty, however, dissuaded any simple arrest. A second set-piece event pulled the investigation into broader scrutiny: the funeral of Edwin Garlick. Rain had threatened again, but held itself until black umbrellas lined the churchyard, giving the procession a look of solemn discipline. Nearly the entire gardening committee appeared in attendance, and with them, half of Flaxborough, some for grief, others out of morbid curiosity. Purbright stood to one side with Love, surveying the somber faces. Mrs. Garlick walked at the front, neither tears nor smiles upon her face, her pace measured like a soldier under inspection. Behind her came Blythe, sweating though the day was cool, and Miss Trimble, rigidly composed in a hat bristling with black feathers. Even the absent-minded vicar appeared unusually alert, perhaps wary lest another hymn board scandalize his congregation. The coffin was borne inside with suitable reverence, but it was during the service that the drama unfolded. At the moment when the vicar spoke of Edwin Garlick's virtues, a man devoted to soil, to patience, to the natural order. A loud cough broke the hush, followed by the sound of something striking the flagstone with a metallic ring. Heads turned instantly. At the third pew, a small parcel had slipped from beneath Miss Trimble's coat. Constables moved to retrieve it. Within a hastily wrapped cloth lay a phial of chemical powder, its label, half-scraped but legible enough. Soil booster compound. B. A ripple of whispered accusations surged through the church, starting in squeaks and growing to a low rumble. Someone hissed, "She killed him with her chemicals," while another whispered, "The widow knew." The vicar flustered, his words trailing into the organ's hum, while Purbright raised one hand, signaling the constables to remove the package quietly without disturbing further. Miss Trimble had turned pale, her lips tightening like a string wound taut. Love exploded in a whisper beside the inspector. "Caught red-handed. Why carry such poison into church unless it was hers all along?" "She slipped, sir. That's our murderer." Purbright kept his gaze on the vicar, who stammered back into scripture. "Perhaps she slipped, Sergeant, but not necessarily in guilt. Many hands could have placed an inconvenient burden upon her cloak. Timing is a curious accomplice. One cannot always tell whether it favors chance or design." After the service, Miss Trimble was detained discreetly, her imploring voice carrying into the drizzle outside. "Planted. They planted it on me. I never carried such filth." Blythe stepped forward theatrically, demanding she confess, his voice carrying like a town crier. The widow, meanwhile, approached Purbright with her steady air, remarking only, "You see how they tear each other down. Edwin would not find this surprising." Back at the station, Purbright personally examined the powder. Its chemical base was common enough to find in farm sheds, but traces on the stopper showed grains of something else mixed in. Pulverized eggshell, a trademark garlic dismissal of those who cheated with their soil. A conflict, then, organic and chemical colliding in one file. It was evidence, yes, but incoherent, as though designed to provoke suspicion without resolution. Love, however, was still convinced. "That file's the very powder the shopkeeper said Blythe bought. Trimble must have had it from him. Maybe they plotted together. If so, that's your conspiracy plan. Chairman and lady both wanting garlic out. Or chairman seeking to rid himself first of garlic, then of complicity by sacrificing Miss Trimble to public suspicion," Purbright suggested mildly. "Did you note his eagerness in accusing? It sprouted too rapidly to be rooted in discovery alone. Accusers often reveal as much as their victims." Love hesitated, struck but had no better answer than a doubtful scribble in his notebook. The evening debrief gathered momentum as the constables compiled every incident, the letters, the gloves, the ribbon, the hymn-board numbers, and now the incriminating file. It might have resembled clarity to less patient observers, but in Purbright's mind it was a compost heap indeed, turned repeatedly, steaming with contradiction, yet promising a fertile bloom if managed properly. He paced slowly before the board, tapping gently each artifact in turn. "See here, gentlemen. Our victim, constant victor, inspires resentment. Our clerk, a convenient drunk, inspires suspicion. Our chairman, ambitious, reveals himself too hurried in blame. Our lady, austere, is twice betrayed, once by ribbon, now by file. And our widow lies, though as yet we cannot say wherefore. This is not one murderer's simple plot. It is an orchestra tuned by competing hands. The melody will reveal itself soon, if we but attend." Love swallowed audibly, half frightened by the sense that his superior spoke not only to the room, but to unseen listeners as well. Later, as lamplight softened the station walls, Purbright allowed himself the faintest, weary sigh. His soft voice held one final observation before the constables dispersed. "The gardener, who hides weeds beneath fresh soil, forgets that time will show their stalks again. We are not yet done turning this heap. Tomorrow will tell us which root is strong enough to choke all others, and that, Sergeant, must be the hand we seek." The words left Love restless long into the night, though his inspector slept soundly, content that the play was nearing its true act, and the audience, the townsfolk, the suspects, even the unseen witness, was now fully committed to the performance. The arrest of Miss Trimble, even temporary as it was, did not calm Flaxborough. On the contrary, it invigorated the town's appetite for scandal. By dawn the next morning, her name was on every tongue. Some neighbours, sworn enemies of hers now, professed they had always suspected her stern manner concealed darker sins. Shopkeepers whispered that she had bought arsenic for roses. Tailors suggested her ribbons were red with reason, and one brave soul muttered she had been spotted in tears by the river, a detail which, though entirely fictitious, spread like nettles across a field. Inspector Purbright watched this theatre with his usual serenity. He stood at his window while rain polished the rooftops and townsfolk bustled through puddles, clutching their gossip like market produce. Beside him, Sergeant Love nervously adjusted his tie, bristling at the delay. "We can't let her sit too long, sir. If she's innocent, we must release her, else the whole town condemns her without trial. If guilty, we need proof before she slips through our fingers." Purbright turned with his mild smile. "The town requires stories more than truth, Sergeant. They will have them regardless of what we prove. Miss Trimble is unlikely to drown while the crowd attempts to baptize her. Our task is not to rescue every reputation, but to find the one root entwined beneath them all." Love shook his head, pacing as though energy might bring clarity. His reason resisted. "Roots and ribbons, sir. That's what it always comes to with you." Purbright showed the faintest twinkle. "And quite right. In any soil, roots and ribbons tell the tale. Shall we visit today's soil instead of repeating yesterday's?" Their destination was the small cottage belonging to the Garlick household gardener, a dull lad named Edgar Tibbs. He was a fellow not much given to talk, possessed of a bovine expression and clothes that looked stitched from discarded sacking. Yet he had been Garlick's right hand in Compost and, as such, potentially a witness. He received them in his kitchen with awkward deference, tugging a cap he did not need indoors. "I just do what I'm told, Inspector," was his repeated refrain. "Mr. Garlick says, 'Dig there,' I dig. Says, 'Turn,' I turn." He kept secrets, fair to say. Had his special mix, always putting eggshells in. Said it was good luck. Never shared it, though. Got folks riled. Purbright inclined his head. "Did you notice anyone around the Heap on the morning of the show?" Tibbs frowned with effort. "Well, sir, I did see Miss Trimble early, like before the folk came. She said she was checking the ribbon around the dais. Had a bundle of it with her, all red. Never thought of it at the time. Later on, I saw the clerk, Mr. Harrow, standing arguing with Mr. Garlick over something small. But quarrels were usual. Might have been over how much space the trophies should take on the table. Never saw him touch the goblet, though." Love leaned forward eagerly. "So, Trimble at the Heap before others, ribbon in hand, and Harrow quarrelling. That looks like collusion to me. Or coincidence," Purbright mused. His voice retained its gentle cadence, but his eyes fixed upon Tibbs. "And yourself, Mr. Tibbs, where were you when the ceremony began?" "Fetching buns from the refreshment tent, sir," Tibbs said, his simplicity unshaken. "Thought to get in before the crowd." Purbright allowed the answer without comment, but as they left the cottage, he murmured quietly, "There is always someone fetching buns when the murder is done. In every village, case, buns appear like alibis, sticky with sugar and innocence. We must not take them at their first sweetness." The sergeant blinked, confused, but dutifully marked it down in his notebook. By afternoon, Miss Trimble had been released for lack of evidence strong enough to hold her. The file, though suspicious, could not be directly tied to her possession. She walked from the station with rigid dignity, refusing to meet the stares of the waiting crowd. Her release, far from quieting matters, only turned suspicion back into wild circulation. Now tongues lashed not just against her, but against Blythe, against Harrow, against Mrs. Garlick. Each hour, a new culprit was chosen, condemned, and replaced. Amid this chaos, Purbright walked to the agricultural store once more, accompanied by Love. He had one simple question for the shopkeeper. To whom else were red ribbons supplied? The answer proved illuminating. Apart from the committee, one other order had been placed. Mrs. Garlick herself had requested a smaller bolt, ostensibly for arranging geranium pots. This she did a week before her husband's death. When asked why she wanted the very shade used at the show, the shopkeeper shrugged. Said if the committee would not hang his victories in red, she'd decorate her own windows with it instead. She seemed bitter enough to mean it. Love could hardly contain himself. Now she ties herself to every strand, sir. Ribbon at her house, ribbon on the compost sack, and she is the one who urged us to suspect Harrow and Blythe. What surer game than to point away while wrapping herself in mourning? Purbright did not disagree, though his face betrayed no triumph. Instead, he asked the shopkeeper for the purchase ledger, scanning names and dates with methodical care. At the bottom of the page lay an entry for 2 more yards, Alderman Hockley, for decorations at the very council hall where the trophies were displayed before the show. Outside the shop, Love groaned. Another red strand. Sir, we'll drown in ribbons before truth shows. Purbright's mild response carried a whisper of satisfaction. Or we shall weave them at last into a pattern. Note, Sergeant, every strand, when stretched, as returns us to Garlick. Every hand pricked by this ribbon had a quarrel with him. This fabric was not purchased for decoration alone. It was purchased for concealment. Evening came, and with it another piece of discord. The vicar sought Purbright in private, confessing to a curious happening. Within the parish records, someone had removed the page containing notes on the committee's rentals of the church hall for the Compost displays. The vicar discovered the loss only that day. Purbright listened, thanked him, and as they walked back through the darkening streets, he remarked to Love, "When pages are torn out, Sergeant, it means someone wishes us to forget not what was written, but who signed it. A rent book tells us more about responsibility than payment. Whoever removed it fears responsibility." Love scribbled and then halted, struck by a thought. "You mean the signature would prove who locked up the hall the night before Garlick was killed?" Purbright's face glimmered in lamplight. "Exactly so. And that key, Sergeant, unlocks not merely a door, but the heart of our case." As they reached the square, Flaxborough's lamps glowed on puddles that mirrored red reflections from the shop windows hung still with ribbon. Purbright paused, gazing at them as though at silent witnesses. "You see how it persists, Sergeant. The town has bound itself in scarlet. Somewhere among these threads is the truth. It waits for us, just a touch out of sight. But when the knot is pulled, the whole tapestry will unravel, and the murderer will stand naked among ribbons." Love shivered, clutching his notebook, aware the inspector already sensed the coming harvest, though the rest of them remained lost in the weeds. The morning after the vicar's revelation arrived clear and crisp. The puddles from yesterday's rain now hardened to a dull sheen, as though even the cobblestones wished to stiffen against scandal. Purbright left the station with his usual unhurried tread, Sergeant Love doggedly at his side, notebooks bulging with tangles of facts which, to his mind, still refused to knot themselves into truth. Love began before they had even reached the market square. "If the church records were altered, sir, someone wanted us not to see which committee member had control of the hall before the show. Only those with the keys could have put the body in the compost heap without the crowd noticing. That narrows it, doesn't it? Whoever signed that rental page is close to the truth." Purbright, who seemed more interested in the cabbage displays outside the greengrocer than in Love's argument, replied mildly, "One should remember, Sergeant, that absence of a signature may be as revealing as its presence. A torn page conceals more than words. It can alter the impression of duty itself. You wipe out a signature, and suddenly no one is accountable. That, I think, is our murderer's true intent." Love puzzled at this, but wrote it anyway. To him, the handwriting of truth was still smudged. They reached the square just in time to see a crowd gathered outside the council offices. Excitement buzzed like trapped bees. On the steps, Alderman Hockley puffed like a bellows, waving a ribbon in his hand. It was scarlet, knotted around what looked suspiciously like another scrap of the missing parish rent book. Purbright's entrance calmed the hubbub, though all eyes stayed fixed upon the alderman. "Found it," Hockley proclaimed, "lodged in the drain pipe at the side of the hall. Who would throw away council records except to hide guilt? A clear sign of conspiracy." The inspector took the fragment delicately, tested it against the lamplight. It bore a partial name, only the initials E.G., followed by the clerk's confirmation. With the tear, the remainder of the names had disappeared. "You see," Love whispered urgently, "E.G. must be Edwin Garlick himself. He had authority in the hall that night, but why would he sign his own burial ground?" Purbright examined the alderman, who shifted under the inspector's gentle stare. "Curious," he whispered almost to himself, "how a man can produce exactly the evidence needed to make himself appear industrious. I wonder why this scrap fell only today into Hockley's capable hands, when the drains have stood untroubled all week." The alderman blustered, turning crimson, sputtering assurances that he was merely civic-minded. The inspector allowed him to puff until deflation set in naturally. Later, in the quiet of the station, Purbright returned the rent book scrap to the evidence board, pinning it beneath the ribbon that had haunted the case from its first turn. He remained silent long enough for Love to fidget, then finally said, "If one were staging a performance, Sergeant, one would wish strong props. The goblet, the gloves, the file, these ribbons. Each prop, conveniently placed, points to the quarrels our victim inspired. But props alone do not reveal the playwright." Love leaned in, voice taut. "Then who writes the script, sir?" Purbright almost smiled. "The one who benefits from the applause." That night, Flaxborough received its third remarkable scandal, the last of its set-piece events. The council chamber, hastily called for an emergency meeting, became the stage. Suspects gathered inadvertently. Blythe, Miss Trimble, Alderman Hockley, and Mrs. Garlick, all pressed by reporters, all seeking the mantle of innocence more publicly than privately. The mayor, overwrought, begged for harmony. What he received was chaos. It began when Miss Trimble, her composure snapping at last, declared before the room, "I never touched that goblet, nor any powder. If proof condemns me, then it is proof manufactured, and I know who benefits most from Edwin Garlick's death. It is his wife." A gasp surged across the chamber. Mrs. Garlick's eyes narrowed, lips tightening into a smile that was not a smile at all. "If you accuse, madam, pray tell the manner. I mourn a husband, not inherit a fortune. Edwin left me little but trophies and talk." Blythe shouted then, delighted to perch upon the accusation. "It's plain enough. She despised his boasting and envied his victories. With him gone, the committee is free, and she needn't suffer his Compost tyrannies." But it was Alderman Hockley who stole the thunder, slamming his hand upon the table, scarlet ribbon bobbing from his pocket. "No, it was Trimble. We all saw how Garlick mocked her arrangements, dismissed her roses, and laughed at her marrows. She laced chemicals with spite. She had the chance. The flower guild was always about when others were gone. I tell you, Inspector, arrest her this instant." The chamber boiled with shouts, the crowd red-faced, each eager to thrust suspicion anywhere but home. And in the middle of it, Purbright sat as though at a mild musical recital, eyes half-lidded, absorbing every word. Finally, when the uproar reached unsustainable pitch, he raised his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, suspicion is abundant soil, and see how quickly envy grows in it. Yet murder requires more water than a quarrel. It requires consequence. Permit me one question. Who, since Edwin Garlick's death, has gained authority over the committee's future?" The hall fell abruptly quiet. Eyes turned to Blythe, whose flush betrayed more than indignation. He stammered, "As chairman, naturally we all—" But Purbright's gaze did not waver. At last he stood, his quiet tone carrying more force than the shouting that preceded it. Tonight, the mask slips. Each of you quarrelled with garlic, yes. Each had had enough chance or anger enough. Yet only one wove the threads repeatedly, making of ribbon a rope to snare others, planting props where convenient, tearing pages where signatures lay. The guilty hand is the one that ensures suspicion grows wild while truth lies buried. Sergeant, tomorrow we shall unearth the last piece, and then Flaxborough's garden shall be turned for good. The crowd parted uneasily, murmurs running like water-breaking dams. Some glared at Blythe, others at the widow, a few still at Miss Trimble. But in Purbright's calm certainty, they felt something inevitable stirring, a harvest they could no longer prevent. And Flaxborough, for all its appetite for gossip, held its breath now, waiting for the inspector's spade to strike root. Dawn rose pale across Flaxborough, heavy with the residue of last night's quarrels in the council chamber. The town seemed oddly subdued, as though half ashamed at its appetite for theatrics, or perhaps exhausted by so many false verdicts. But Inspector Purbright, arriving at his office precisely on time, looked as unruffled as ever. If anything, his calm had deepened, as though certainty now rested quietly in his pocket beside his pipe. Sergeant Love, however, arrived in a state of nervous fervour, his notes strewn with arrows, underlinings, and theories stacked atop each other so densely that none could be read clearly. Love wasted no time. "Sir, last night showed us plainly. It must be Blythe. He benefits most from Garlick's death, chairmanship, trophies, and authority. He bought the chemicals. He demanded ribbons. He accused the loudest. Every thread ends with him." Purbright softened his gaze, as patient with Love as he was with the weeds flourishing in this case. "It is tempting to think so, Sergeant, and you are right in one regard. Every thread leads to him. But I am reminded of gardening children who, tugging endlessly at leaves, break the wrong stalk because its green seemed brightest. Guilt is never placed where it is most eagerly visible. Let us examine not who points the most fingers, but how those fingers came to be pointing at all." Before Love could argue, Constable Dacre entered with fresh development. The gloves found near the refreshment table had been traced. A washerwoman recognized them as belonging not to Harrow, but to Alderman Hockley, a fact she asserted with triumph, declaring she had mended one thumb only a week prior. Love slapped his notebook. There, another liar. Hockley planted them to frame the clerk, then produced that rent book scrap to discover and shift guilt again. He should swing for conspiracy. Purbright accepted the information with calm satisfaction. There we have it then, confirmed suspicion made unsubtle. Our older man played gardener too avidly in sowing weeds about his fellows. But even this does not yet clear our soil. He is cunning, but no playwright. He has not had the patience or the delicate hand. One sees it in his haste to flaunt discoveries. The inspector then decided, with his usual mild phrasing, that the time had come for a visit to Mrs. Garlick once again. Love, brimming with arguments to the contrary, nevertheless followed. They found the widow in her immaculate sitting-room, the geraniums still upright as soldiers at attention. She received them without expression, her eyes sharp yet shielded, her posture one of immaculate control. Purbright admired the flowers before speaking. "Mrs. Garlick, we understand you purchased scarlet ribbon a week before your husband's death. You told the shopkeeper it was to honor his victories. Why did you not display it at the ceremony?" Her lips pressed slightly before answering. "Because Edwin did not wish it. He said his achievements stood without embellishment, but I wanted the house to reflect pride, even if he mocked me for it. Nothing more." "Nothing more," Purbright repeated thoughtfully. His gaze rested on her hands. They were pale, slender, restless, twisting the already immaculate edge of her sleeve. At length he asked gently, "And during your husband's final mourning, you said you remained at home with linens. Can you prove this?" She looked him directly in the eye, unflinching. "No, Inspector. But why should I need to? All of Flaxborough knows Edwin's enemies. They were in plain sight. Why would his wife, who lived with his faults but also with his stability, wish him gone? Love bristled in righteous indignation, but Purbright merely inclined his head. Indeed, why would she? I leave it to the garden itself to answer. As they departed, the sergeant hissed, "She gave nothing away, sir." "She's calculating." Purbright smiled faintly. People who lie most fiercely, Sergeant, often believe the lie themselves. They are never our hardest prey. It is those who speak the truth, yet at the wrong time, that mislead us most. The day carried them next to the greenhouse of Blythe, for confrontation and clarity. Blythe puffed indignantly upon their arrival, wiping sweat that seemed born of nerves more than steam. "This persecution is outrageous. You've all but tried me in the council, yet I'm no killer. Chemicals I buy, yes, but for vegetables, not crime. If Edwin had been more sensible, he'd have done likewise instead of prattling on about eggshells." Purbright glanced at Love, then back at Blythe. "And yet he is gone, and his trophies stand vacant. One could almost imagine fortune knocked them from the shelf directly into your hands." Blythe faltered, his mouth dry. "That was a chance. I never asked for it. If anyone benefited, it's his wife. No husband means she manages his legacy, funds, house, and peace from a man almost everyone despised." Love jabbed his pencil. "So you throw it back on the widow now?" "Convenient." Purbright's quiet tone intervened. "Envy is webbing, Sergeant. Each insect trapped within imagines the spider lies elsewhere. What matters is not who envied, but who spun." They left Blythe sputtering. By the time dusk spread a red wash across the cobbles, Purbright called his men again to the evidence board. Now it gleamed with artifacts. A goblet, gloves, ribbons, a file, fragments of torn rent book, and anonymous notes. Each, when pinned alone, looked incriminating. Together they looked contradictory, even nonsensical. Yet Purbright stood before them with calm authority. "Each item," he said to the silent room, "was placed in our path, not merely to accuse, but to distract. One person sought to tie this murder in ribbons, display it like a grotesque ceremony, each prop echoing Edwin Garlick's pride and his enemy's spite. In truth, few crimes reveal themselves with such symmetry. Why, then, so many? Because our murderer is not hiding one act. They are inventing many, weaving a play upon which the town might feast. Each clue is true enough in itself. Genuine gloves, genuine ribbon, genuine wrath. But each was transplanted from its soil to another bed." Love, pale but enthralled, whispered, "But who had wit enough to bind it all together?" Purbright allowed the faintest smile, letting his gaze drift toward the constables as though including even them as part of the act. "Tomorrow, Sergeant, we reveal it. Tonight, we let the weeds believe they have flourished. Tomorrow we pull them up by the root in full view of all. The guilty cannot help but believe their own fabrication is strongest. It is that belief that shall undo them." Silence followed, filled with the sound of dripping rain from the eaves. Purbright reached out and tapped the red ribbon gently where it pinned the board. "Scarlet runs through every hand. Chairman, spinster, alderman, widow. But scarlet fabric is not blood. The one who confuses the two hopes we shall never notice the difference. That is the error they will regret." He extinguished his pipe, regarding his sergeant with quiet invitation, as though to ask not only him, but every witness, seen and unseen, one simple question: would they be ready when the unmasking came? Morning broke sharp and brassy over Flaxborough on the day Inspector Purbright decided the mask would fall. It was one of those mornings that seemed crafted for a ceremony. The air was bright but brittle, the pavement scrubbed by rain, and townsfolk eager for rumors to ripen into certainty. At 9:30, word carried itself like a church bell that the inspector had called an assembly at the municipal hall. By 10, the benches were filled with fearful suspects, officious councillors, and the ever-famished audience of townspeople who never tired of observing their neighbours' disgrace. Purbright entered quietly, with Sergeant Love in tow, and stood before the evidence board that constables had neatly transported into the hall. Goblet, gloves, ribbon, file, scraps of record, all were displayed like a grotesque horticultural exhibit. The murmurs hushed, save for the insistent scratching of Love's pencil as Purbright opened with his customary mildness. My friends, Flaxborough has been well entertained this week, though not by choice. A man adored by Compost and detested by rivals was discovered murdered, his trophy turned weapon, his body absurdly displayed. Our task has been to ask not only who might strike such a blow, but who had the wit to stage so elaborate a show. For make no mistake, this crime has been staged, every prop planted as carefully as a bulb in spring. A ripple of unease moved across the benches. Blythe shifted in his seat, his face slick though the room was cool. Miss Trimble pursed her lips until they nearly vanished. Alderman Hockley fumbled with his handkerchief. Mrs. Garlick sat rigid, her eyes bright but impenetrable. Purbright stepped to the first photograph, the compost heap and the goblet half buried. We begin with the weapon. Who had access? Everyone. Edwin Garlick himself polished it that morning, but to say it was therefore his own fault is nonsense. Let us carry on. He moved to the gloves. Placed at the refreshment table. Stained convincingly. At first we imagined them as Harrow's poor clerk, already drunk and bitter. But see, too large for his hands. Later proved to be Hockley's, courtesy of a washerwoman's memory. Why place the gloves of one man where another would be suspected? To seed confusion, they were props. He gestured next to the ribbon fragments. Scarlet satin runs through the case like a river dyed. Blythe ordered it, Trimble arranged it, Hockley flaunted it, and the widow purchased it. Too many hands, too many fragments, too carefully multiplied. One ribbon concealed a knot upon a compost sack. Its fibre led us forward, but not to what it bound, rather to who needed us to keep following scarlet threads until we drowned in them. He touched the phial of chemicals. Trimble was caught with this in church, yet the powder was doctored, half chemical, half eggshell, mixture Garlick favoured, a parody of opposition for which she had neither patience nor gall. It was thrust upon her to disgrace, not to condemn. Finally, he pinned the torn note and rent book fragment between his fingers. Pages torn, initials left, scraps too perfectly discovered. This was not an accident, but a theatre, designed to fan suspicion against each in turn, so that while the town debated innocence, no one would notice the true hand pruning its weeds. The silence deepened as Purbright turned, his voice still calm, his smile faint but clear. So who profits? Not the spinsters mocked for their flower arrangements, not the alderman who revels in empty theatrics, not the clerk, too hapless even to conduct his own alibi. And Blythe, though ambitious, is too coarse a gardener to cultivate such a delicate deceit. Who gains, gentlemen? Who gains peace, authority over reputation, and, should suspicion flourish wildly, protection behind mourning black? Only one, the widow. A collective gasp swelled, followed by the scrape of shoes as all eyes whipped toward Mrs. Garlick. She did not flinch. She sat like marble in the lamplight, her lips only now curving into something perilously close to a smirk. Purbright walked toward her, unhurried. You told us you spent the morning on linens. A harmless lie, but a lie nonetheless. You knew the goblet was polished because it was you who saw it last in Edwin's hand. You purchased ribbon to decorate, though your house bore none, for its ends were left tied across sacks concealing the body you buried the night before. You told us Harrow threatened Edwin, which he did, but conveniently omitted your own threats, overheard by Miss Trimble weeks earlier, that you would see your husband stuffed back into his heap if he crowed once more. In every tale, Mrs. Garlick, you told enough truth to distract, enough lies to direct suspicion outward, and planted each prop as carefully as your geraniums. Gasps and mutters twisted through the hall. Love nearly dropped his pencil, startled by such open clarity. But Purbright's voice stayed calm, even compassionate. Motive is simple, is it not? Years of scorn, his obsessive pride in Compost that smothered your marriage. No peace in household, only earth and trophies. Peace came only by silencing him, and yet you detected too late that a simple truth was insufficient. You staged a whole performance, scattered crimson through the town, ribbons, notes, gloves, files. The color of envy, the color of distraction. You counted it enough to overwhelm the method. Mrs. Garlick rose slowly. Her composure no longer seemed armor, but confession. And would you not have done the same, Inspector, if chained to such arrogance year on year? He lived only for a pile of refuse, and I lived only for his shadow in it. Is a woman to be buried alive so her husband might win rosettes? Blythe shouted in triumph. I said it was her all along. But the inspector raised a hand, silencing the room. Pride, madam, may be compost for envy, but murder, however cunningly staged, is not fertilizer, but poison, and poison grows nothing but ruin. 2 constables stepped forward, crisp in duty. Mrs. Garlick allowed herself to be led away, her head high, her voice sharp with final defiance. Then the weeds win, Inspector. Remember that. The crowd erupted, half in satisfaction, half in shock, but Purbright remained still. Love whispered beside him, shaken yet awed. You knew it then, sir, since the first ribbon. The inspector allowed himself a mild glance of amusement. Since the first lie, Sergeant. Ribbons only confirmed it. She forgot, you see, that compost, while covering, also preserves. Truth, once buried, has a way of ripening until it must be dug up. He turned to the watching assembly, his eyes glancing beyond them as if to include even those unseen listeners who had followed quietly all along. So, my friends, our garden is cleared, but Flaxborough grows quickly. Shall we see what next season's sprout brings? And with that, his mild smile returned, his case closed, yet his gaze already drifting toward the next quiet scandal waiting patiently beneath the surface of ordinary lives.